Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming on another very rainy afternoon. The rain seems to be going on forever this year. So thanks for coming out. This is our latest seminar in our Histories of Capitalism and Race series. I think it's the 9th that we've done in this academic year. So this is why we're but also very energized and excited for today's talk. So just to say, credit as always goes to Sarah and Henny and Samia, who's not with us, and Tanvi, who makes everything happen for making all of this possible. And today we're lucky enough to be joined by Julia Elyachar, who will present on her latest book. After Julia has presented, we have discussant comments from the wonderful Meera Sabaratnam and Reem, Abuzaid as well. So I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to each of them. Julia Elyachar is an esteemed anthropologist and political economist based at a place called Princeton, a little university in the US. You might have heard of. Julia has an amazing biography, which I'll quote from a little bit here. She researches on the Middle East and particularly Egypt. And in this work, she engages with a long and rich history of markets, finance, and global infrastructures, of commerce and mobility in the region. Julia was also a research analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is really fascinating. She's also lived and worked in Slovenia for a very long time. And she also, as she mentions in the opening of the book we're going to talk about today, she draws on her own family history in Palestine. So she's the great-granddaughter of the founder of an early 20th century stone crushing factory in Jerusalem. Which is an amazing detail. Likewise, she's from a line of Ottoman sarafs or money brokers in Palestine who mediated flows of commerce across empire in cooperation with Ottoman officials and factors of many trading nations. So really, really interesting embodied history there. Julia published the much acclaimed book, Markets of Dispossession, NGOs, Economic Development, and the State in Cairo with Duke Uni Press in 2005. And she's published loads of wonderful articles since then. And we're here today to talk about her newest book, On the Semicivilized, Coloniality, Finance, and Embodied Sovereignty in Cairo, also published by Duke just last year. Meera Sabaratnam really needs no introduction around these parts at all. But I will introduce you anyway. Meera is an associate professor of international relations at Oxford. It's a position she's held since 2023. At heart, though, I think she's a SOASian, having been here for maybe a decade, dare I say. So Meera published the book Decolonizing Intervention, International State Building in Mozambique with Bloomsbury in 2017. Countless really influential and fascinating articles broadly on the colonial and post-colonial dimensions of world politics. And Meera is currently writing a book entitled Complex Indebtedness, which elaborates a post-colonial analysis of the international system with relations of indebtedness, both material and moral, at its centre. So we look forward to discussing that book, probably in this space. Reem Abuzaid is a lecturer in politics here at SOAS, specialising in the politics of the Middle East. She completed her PhD in exactly the same place as me, in the politics department at the University of Warwick. So this is where her research explored the intersections of law, politics, gender and sexuality, with particular attention to how the governance of subaltern groups becomes entangled in political processes, and most notably state making in the Middle East. And her published work examines the everyday manifestations of state power, as well as forms of resistance enacted through litigation, analysing both the modalities and transformative potential of such engagements. And you can read her work in the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, among others. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Julia to talk about her wonderful book. Thank you. Can you join me in welcoming Julia?
Everybody, it's such a great honor and pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you, Sarah and Samia, Lisa, and Penny for the invitation and for all of your help getting here. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, everything fine? Okay, great. So today, in the 29th month of ongoing genocide in Gaza, the notion of the semi-civilized is more relevant than ever as a way to understand our world. First associated with the barbarian, okay, turn on my time. Okay. The barbarian and the nomad in 18th century stadial theory of stages. Semi-civilized was crucial in the making and unraveling of the world order put into place after World War I. Discourse of the semi-civilized, though, was never totalizing. Submerged potentialities for life flourish in the crevices, oh, there we are, good, channels, that's perfect, and surrounds of even the most targeted urban communities. But let me start with how I got there, even though I don't have to say all of it, because Lisa already did some of it. So I first heard about Cairo long before I went there from my grandfather, who was born and raised in Jerusalem, Palestine. And as Lisa already said, he was the son and the grandson of an Ottoman Sarraf, translated as banker broker, and grandson of the chief rabbi of Palestine. Men of the family studied in Beirut, Damascus, Istanbul, and Cairo. Women stayed at home in Jerusalem and managed all the letter writing that kept people together. Cairo was not his home, but it was a place where he was at home. After my grandfather's death, I found a small suitcase in a corner of his dusty attic. Inside, I found, among other things, exit documents from the Ottoman Empire and the British Mandate. If you read the introduction, it's repeating what you already know. So these documents tracked essential information in cross-imperial infrastructures of mobility, sovereign affiliation, and commerce, instead of like passports. And the categories that were in here opened up questions that I explore in the book. So that was kind of a way to open the book, is how I started. And this one shows, for example, place of birth is Al-Quds Sharif, or Jerusalem. Occupation was also important for the Ottomans to track, and he has Sarraf, and etc. So let's switch to the next one. In the next generation, under the British Mandate after World War I, his son answers a similar kind of exit document that's organized differently, now in English for one thing, with the word merchant instead of, let's say, Sarraf. So that world of the Sarraf and how trade under the Ottomans is apparently gone, although we'll see. There's a new question, nationality. I always imagine him wondering and waiting, but he wrote down a word, local. Now this really trumped me for years, completely confused me. What the heck could this mean that nationality is local? But long before I learned of this family inheritance, I tracked it. I won't tell all the things, I went studied economics. I worked at the Fed to learn about debt and finance and capital. I worked on the Ottoman debt administration. My PhD was again sort of on debt and finance. And I was doing things that at the time felt radically different. Like, how can I jump around like that? But over the years, there were lines of clear connection that emerged. And even in relation to that weird answer on the nationality question, local. So local, not in English, but it was an official Ottoman category. It stood in contrast to the Baradli, who benefited from extraterritorial rights, which is one of the worst words, even if you're a native English speaker in English, about which more in a moment. So the term local also resonated for me as someone who had lived in Egypt for like 5 years, such as the Afrangi or the Khawaga versus the Shabi. These categories were absent in all the social science literature I read about social structure, political economy in Egypt, but it was everywhere in film, literature, political slogans. And so something resonated. And I found here the kind of convergence of the ethnographic and the archival, the conceptual and the historical, that really is my sweet spot. That's where I love working. And so to understand all of this, I had to go back to my master's work on the Ottoman capitulations. So these, I don't know if everyone in the room studies this stuff. Tell me to stop if you know all this. These are extraterritorial treaties or treaties, bilateral treaties and private international law organized on principles of extraterritoriality or exterritorial. See, I can't even say it, exterritoriality, as it was called in the 18th century. Usually in which one state, usually an imperial state, not a nation state, allows another polity to exercise jurisdiction over its own nationals within the first state's domains, not borders. This was an extension of personality of law, a principle associated with the Roman Empire. So in this framework, and again, if you, it's all, excuse me, a subject's attachment to the sovereign is embodied. It's in your person and moves with you when you move through space, as opposed to being regulated by borders. And so the sovereign moves through space together with its subject on the move, even inside the domains of another polity. So in the 18th and 19th century, Western legal jurists really struggled to make sense of all of this as they were trying to figure out what is the Ottoman Empire. It clearly wasn't primitive, that anthropological category, which had certain meaning to anthropologists associated with no recognizable sovereign. Not fail on that one. They've been signing treaties with the Ottoman sovereign since the early 16th century. No religion, fail, that they could recognize, and no markets. That doesn't work either. So those were the kind of anthropological categories of the primitive, but they clearly were not civilized. So what were they? And so in the 4 stages theory that was then used by Adam Smith and a lot of other foundational social theorists and political economists, the Ottomans got slotted in the middle. They were semi-civilized, somewhere in the middle. This notion was racialized at the turn of the 20th century. This is a project I'm working on now, by the way, happy to talk about it later, in part through research projects in Ottoman Syria that gave a scientific basis for the denial of self-determination at the end of World War I. More than 100 years later, this condition of endlessly deferred sovereignty, even as the international order that was put into place at the end of World War I lies buried under the rubble of Gaza, we have to make sense of what all this was about and what it means. So I'm going to quickly, I don't want to, some of this is again, in chapters you may have read, but I call in the book this infrastructures of the semi-civilized. I go through, take for a moment when Egypt was declared independent in 1922. The British protectorate over Egypt ended, but it was far from full sovereignty. Britain retained de facto rule over Sudan. It retained control over Egypt's external defenses. It claimed sovereignty, moreover, over all the residents of Egypt who had those extraterritorial privileges under terms of the capitulations as part of the Ottoman Empire and its aftermath. And so, and crucially, it claimed the right to guarantee the security of communications of the British Empire in Egypt. So this was another term that was really interesting for me over the past 10, 15 years, to realize that communications is not communications theory as we think of it today, but rather this meant commerce, language, and also the right to mobility as conceived under what was called natural law. And so this inspired me to look at the kind of communicative infrastructures I've been working on and are in the second chapter that was given to read, I think, some of it, that sustain collective life together with physical communicative channels such as telegraphs and cables in one field of analysis. So I have to get through here faster. So that right that Britain claimed over communications, security of communications, included the Suez Canal, for example, and so in which tens of thousands of Egyptians and Sudanese workers built in the 1860s with French financing and engineering, and was covered by the capitulations. So Britain claimed sovereignty over it, and thus when it was nationalized by Abdel Nasser in 1956, that was unacceptable to the civilized war, and war was launched. But I want to focus for a minute on telecommunications, which is another key part of that security of communications over which was Britain's sovereignty still. So, and I take the example in the book, which one are we on? Oh God, I've been forgetting about the slides. Eastern Telegraph, I'm about to talk about Eastern Telegraph.
Yeah, we're on track with slides.
Perfect. So this is a British company that built the first telegraph line in Egypt in 1854, connecting Cairo and Alexandria. It built and it sent the first direct message from the UK to India via Egypt in 1870. Maybe to the next slide. So you can see how everything, a lot of you might know this, everything runs through Egypt. And guess what? If it's running through Egypt, running through the Ottoman Empire, it's under the terms of the capitulations and it's extraterritorial. So all of these lines underground, above ground, I don't know about over the air in the clouds, but they fall under terms of the capitulations and they're not legally in Egypt. And so all matters pertaining to the work of Eastern Telegraph were managed under the capitulations by the consular courts and then another system that was set up called the mixed courts in Egypt to try to domesticate it. So, so Egypt bought Eastern Telegraph in 1881, creating the Telephone and Telegraph Authority. In 1957, finally, a year after the nationalization of the Suez Canal, these telegraph lines and the company were nationalized and transferred to the Egyptian Ministry of Communications. The Mubarak regime tried to privatize it, but this was part of the big fights that were going on under Mubarak between the public sector, the private sector, and intense conflicts that led up, well, let's just say intense conflicts. But in 22, things changed again under Sisi, where Egypt quietly sold off 20% of this strategic communications infrastructure, not back to the UK, not to the US, but to the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Qatar. So this was not called privatization. It all went under the radar, as a lot of these kind of privatizations are doing. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. How much time do I have left? So extraterritoriality was raising its head again. Resources that have been made public wealth through revolutions and anti-colonial struggles were moved at the stroke of a pen into sovereign wealth funds that function outside of national economy, accounts of national economy, and over which the states in which they exist have no say. So in this trend that I'm looking at here, and a kind of renewal, let's say, or renewed obvious relevance in one sphere of extraterritoriality in the semi-civilized condition, public wealth is capitalized and turned into financialized assets, generating profits for, the wealthiest few. Some of this could be seen in Cairo. And then in the book, we can go to slide 7, I think. Next one. Next one. Okay, maybe I took it out. Put it back. Look at something while I'm talking. So then I talk in the book about the Mugama, which some of you will know as the minister, the home of the Interior Ministry of Egypt, since it was gifted to Egypt from the Soviet Union in 1951. A place of impossible lines, random and shifting rules, ubiquitous danger, and all of the pieces of paper that one had to get to do anything, to move anywhere, had to be gotten in the holes of the Mugama, from which one would hopefully emerge okay. Even after the regime, in the wake of the January 25th revolution and then the coup of 2013, and they shut down, moved government buildings, like shut them all down, all over downtown in the area of the revolution and moved them elsewhere in a process of that I describe in the book in a chapter you didn't get, which at first is the army coming down and closing the streets, just like in Paris, the Bastille, just no one can move. These channels will be closed. Over time, it starts to happen through mobilizing, moving all of these sources, buildings, land, concrete things that people fought and died for, making them assets, moving them into sovereign wealth funds in ways that didn't need any public debate. And so I call it in the book financialized counterinsurgency. So that was going on at this time and in various places. So what happened to the Mugama? It was quiet for a long time, empty for a long time. Yeah, we can do the new beginning picture there. That's, yeah. Okay, 22, the Sovereign Fund of Egypt, consortium including Global Ventures, Oxford Capital Group, and a UAE-based investment fund won the bid to turn the Mugama, the home of the Interior Ministry of the state, into a luxury Hilton hotel. This was announced finally in February 2025, although that picture, I'm not sure when I took that picture, it must have been at least a year or two earlier. It would be a new beginning, but a new beginning of what, is the question, of course. So, so just for a couple of minutes, I want to say all of the open channels of a state that does not have that often fictitious, but complete control over homogeneous space that is kind of the hallmark of the Weberian definition of the state or territory. The notion of territory, it's complete, it's homogeneous, the state controls it, you have borders, you have passports. In fact, it's never been so completely, it's never worked that way, as we all know, and many of you work on this and think about it. But extraterritoriality has always existed together with territoriality from the very beginning. First, because the Ottomans were no exception. This is no regional studies question, right? As we know, this is one of the leading organizers of international commerce through 1920, right? So this is nothing exclusive. And this, for me, another point I'll get into in the book, but it's one of the problems for me of a lot of the colonialism discourse, that it tends to absorb and make assumptions about territoriality. But that's a side thing. If anyone's interested, we can talk about it. The Ottoman capitulations and that principle of extraterritoriality as a way to organize states after World War I was officially ended in 1920, together with the Ottoman Empire itself. But 2001, jump ahead to the US war on terror in 2001, it made all of the arguments for the legal justification for war on principles of extraterritoriality, and that were carved out in these early commercial relations with the Ottoman Empire. So it was also used by British legal scholars working in the British Mandate government of Palestine to provide grounds in international law, which was very important, of course. It was a lawmaking empire, Great Britain, for implanting in Palestine a self-governing Jewish colony, or yishuv. And this logic merged Ottoman Jews of the kind, that I was talking about in that first slide, who were fully local, together in the same category as the new European settlers. And this is part of the story. It's another story that takes us to Palestine, Israel, and the current situation. Today, in 2026, well, I'll just say that I don't have that argument about the mandate so much in the book, but I've written about it elsewhere. But all of this together has created like this very unstable, kind of confusing situation, which for me, I first saw like ethnographic, whatever, walking around in Cairo. There was one year in 2022, I think it was, where like in one day I saw like 3 drivers of cars, taxi drivers, whatever, who were getting used to GPS on their phones or whatever, like lose control of their cars, spin around. You ever seen it? And like not know where they were. And it felt for me finally in the midst of a world of climate change, and I mean, so many things now I could talk about that I think about outside the confines of this book, of where the ground that we stand on was being unsettled. And what was the relationship of body to ground? Remember, this was a story also very much about personal law and about embodied sovereignty and embodied infrastructures. So what's the relation of body to ground in the kind of times that we're living through? So there's a lot one could say about that. And here I'm referring to the second chapter, the chapter 6 that you were given to read. But the very right to an embodied self is very much in question in 2026, especially for those relegated to the status of the semi-civilized, even as that condition is spreading outside of today's Middle East. It's becoming a prevailing logic, it's in Minneapolis to as well. So logic of the barbarian, who is not the barbarian, which was part of the origin story of the semi-civilized, who is not part of humanity and political order, of course, came to full expression in the genocide in Gaza. So all of that is happening as life itself, daily life, becoming harder and harder in Cairo. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. For those who haven't read the book, this might be a lot, but for those of you who read it, hopefully you're following along. So at the same time, life and movement and survival, getting food, all kinds of things that previously were not in, really, they were difficult, but they weren't like such a question as now in Cairo was changing things. So what do we think? How does this upset the whole notion of stable ground that that lies at the bottom of political economy and political theory? How can we know how to stand and move and make movements collectively when the ground is collapsing under our feet? And how can we consider moving through collective injury when supposedly stable ground and the supposed unitary space of homogeneous territory of a nation state is breaking up, or let alone when ground is strewn with bodily remains that surviving bereaved must sift through to search for body parts of beloved ones to bury, while the most wealthy turn that decimated ground into financialized real estate assets. This is, the Trump plan in Gaza. So at the same time, I have 5 seconds. The semi-civilized, the barbarian, the nomad, it's a stark story that I tell in the book of a category we haven't been talking about that much. But it also, and I try to show this in the book as well, leads to potentialities and ways of mobility and the persistent attachment to life about which we've been learning so much. With the international order to which the semi-civilized were denied entry as being unfit for sovereignty after World War I. With that world order buried under the rubble at the moment, it's really unclear what are the shifting horizons of political life, of the sovereignty itself. And the only thing I'll end with is that one thing is clear to me. I have a lot of questions since I finished that book a couple of years ago, is that the challenge of how to constitute and preserve collective life is one we face together in Cairo, in Gaza, London, and far beyond. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Reem, do you want to take it away?
Okay. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was really, you hit on many points that I had in mind reading your book, and I really, really enjoyed it. And it, for me, it had this very particular effect that I wanted to talk to you about today, particularly because it's quite a very decent bridge between what is personal and what is political. Reading the book felt like I'm accompanying you as you accompany your great-grandfather, the subject of Ottoman Empire, and your grandfather, the subject of the British occupied Palestine. And I'm also an Egyptian, so I tagged along as a local of the semi-civilized. So basically, my comments are also very much personal, as much as it is political and intellectual and academic. So I'll get cracking, starting with my comments. And I want to start from where you ended, the conclusion, the barzakh, more or less. And I found the image you created connecting the preconception,
Preconception. How we know? I didn't mention it here. It's you got stuck with the word.
Sorry,
How we know?
I mention it.
I didn't read it. It's a physiology term from the mid-19th century. How we know where our body is in space and how body parts. Do I know that my hand is in front of me? Do I know where I'm standing? Yeah.
So I found this connection, the image connecting this concept with the barzakh, very much powerful. You employ this connection as an entry point into rethinking one's sense of location, one's sense of ground, where they're sitting, standing, and if they're fortunate enough, protest, while this very same ground is shaking, repeatedly, chattering, inherently unsettled. This is all as this body that we're talking about is made to move along the barzakh. So this barzakh is somehow separating while giving this illusion of a pathway from the land of the semi-civilized, moving forward through the work of development and political science and all to the Western civilized space. And I found this image very powerful, and tell you why. You present it towards the end of the book, right? But up until then, I carried this unsettling feeling that your book assumes a type of mobility that I did not experience as an Egyptian, and to be more specific, as an Egyptian political scientist. The way I experienced the semi-civilized as a local resembles what you wrote, and I'm quoting you. The semi-civilized were kept in the waiting room of history after World War I, where they have been ever since. So I was there, in this stilling position in the waiting room, while the world around me shifted. So you talk about extraterritoriality as connecting or making sovereignty embodied into oneself, but this assumes that this self is moving. But what about the local who's actually sitting still? So this feeling obviously does not deny me from capturing the very amazing depiction of the semi-civilized that you provided. And I just want to reiterate some of the points that you excellently placed in the book. Obviously, Egypt inheriting the semi-civilized status as a legacy of the Ottoman Empire, forced onto it at that point of independence. However, being hooked into the infrastructure, the global infrastructure of finance, the flow of commerce, trade, and debt, and because of the international law's extraterritoriality, it is placed in a position of disadvantage. So from this point onward, as time moves, the semi-civilized characteristics of Egypt does not shift. It continues, repeatedly reproduced, moving between different sets of beneficiaries. So historically, it was the US, the UK, and France. Now it's the Gulf. So far, all this does not change that static experience of being stagnant as a local in the semi-civilized state of Egypt. Unable to move, to break free from these webs of power, hegemony, and domination. Again, as a political scientist, influenced by the existing literature on colonialism, post-colonialism, and the Orientalist, primitive, civilized divide, which your book actually does excellent job problematizes, I was assured that such an experience is static. Colonial powers retreat, and post-colonial regimes carry on fulfilling the mission, reproducing systems of inequalities between the locals or between the locals and the foreigners, similar to what you captured in your chapter on the mixed courts jurisprudence. We also learned that this violence is characteristically colonial, despite being fulfilled by co-opted and authoritarian regimes. The system of oppression and inequality shifts and changes, but on the receiving end, the local overall experience remains unchanged. Their genetic capacities here, in my view, is muted, a mere anecdote. This situation is unescapable, and you reiterate this over and over. That's like, it's very, very controlling. You can't just escape it. History tells us that you can't find a way out. So I feel this feeling that I'm standing somewhere, that I'm not moving. And against this, your book actually does very urgent work by presenting an alternative pathway to look at these relationships, what you call the relationships of subjects to state, bodies to rulers, residents to land, commoners to their cities, as an affair that takes place on the move. A relationship that materializes as the civilized remain hooked into this globalized chain of commerce, infrastructure, and finance. Obviously, losing through this situation parts of sovereignty, one piece of land after the other, one infrastructure after the other. In this view, territory is very central, in my view. The political science that we studied assumes that the material platform onto which these relationships unfold, if we're lucky enough, we resist and debate, is itself present. Why you argue against it? You say it's shaken, eaten up, non-existent. This is when I come to terms with what the sense of movement you wanted to inject into your readers. So after that, I returned again to other parts of your book as a question animated my second reading, is there a way out? Like, is there a way that we could move beyond what we're stuck in? And this brought me to your second focus of the book, where you discuss that in the face of the fact that colonial violence, the violence of the empire against the semi-civilized is collective, and therefore bigs a collective way out. And I quote you here again saying about this collectivity that nobody moves through the world unaided. Autonomy is an illusion. Just like gestures in the semiotic commons are distributed, so too is agency distributed and collective at every scale. So indeed, like I buy into the story, like it gets me hooked. It brings me to my final point, which is your interesting finding that this global order that Egypt bends itself back and forth to fit its mold is shattered. You say the house to which that waiting room of history led no longer exists. The house is gone together with all the houses and buildings and streets of Gaza, the world from which the semi-civilized were excluded, dehumanized as barbarians, has collapsed. And with the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, even the right of the semi-civilized to a living body came radically into question. So there is no barzakh. We're absolutely lost. We're no longer hooked. We're like free floating into space, which is actually terrifies me even more than when I started reading your book. So you propose a very daring way forward, creatively weaving neuroscience and anthropology into an understanding of political potentiality, which is, you talk about the embodied commons of the semi-civilized. These are the snippets of experiences that first had seemed strange, unthinkable, and abnormal that can become a norm, right? This is when actually I have more questions than comments, and particularly your framing of the nationalization under Nasser, looking at it from the semi-civilized point of view as a very daring experience where Nasser tried to basically claim sovereignty over a territory, like unitary sovereignty over a bounded territory. You present it this way, but also you take credit out of it. You say it was just something like an experiment with no politics. The politics injected into it because obviously alternative flow of commerce and finance coming from the USSR, therefore shifting towards socialism. And I'll end here with maybe like a question about, obviously there are alternative flows of infrastructure flowing around us. Here I'm talking about China, here I'm talking about Russia, here I'm talking about even collective experiences like forming the BRICS. Would that somehow present a common project that we could build on, in your view, or not? I'll stop here, and thank you so much. It was really, really amazing reading it. Really,
great.
thank you.
It's really good. Thank you very much, Julia, for the presentation and to read the comments as well. I was really excited when Sarah invited me to come and speak to this. I came across your work quite a few years ago, I think during the pandemic when I was starting this debt project, and I actually came across the wonderful reading list that you'd put together on debt, one of your teaching syllabuses, which has continued to be useful in my research. But I was really excited because I think, and as I'm dwelling in this kind of thinking about debt space, that attention to debt and to finance as specific modalities of capitalism, or the constitutive elements of capitalism, has been really underdone, and it's been partly underdone in critical literatures because of its kind of technical character. And so your work is like just incredibly valuable because it starts to open up those vistas of how to think critically about something which is
even the sort of language used to describe it is designed to obfuscate and to resist interrogation, right? And so all of these terms, all of the vocabulary of collateralized debt obligations and yields and returns and all of that stuff. So yeah, I think this is something that we really need in this moment, and financialization through every crisis gets deeper and deeper. And so every piece of land becomes an asset available for kind of financial capture. And even crises such as climate change, you know, having started as a demand for reparations, become a site for more lending and more lending and more lending. So yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, just today I was reading about Ethiopia's bondholders are going to take them to court because they've defaulted on a debt, and there's a kind of fight amongst the international parties who are the creditors, who as to how that debt issue is going to be resolved and who's going to get what haircut and so on. So, you know, then you read about the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, you're like, oh, well, this looks awfully familiar, right? And so what I really appreciate is the way in which you have like respatialized and historicized all of this stuff that we, at least the most of the mainstream literature on finance and financialization, assumes is a relatively new phenomenon. Right? And I suppose this plays into my own kind of intuitions or thinking about how imperialism continues into the present, but also rethinking like what is the nature of imperialism and detethering it from ideas of territorial control, but being about essentially the management of relations of indebtedness and like authority over who owes what to whom and in what kinds of spaces. So I really appreciated that, and I really appreciated the way in which that came through in this book. I wanted to ask some questions which come from my very different disciplinary like positionality as someone who's not an anthropologist or an ethnographer. Because there's a very, very rich set of concepts in the book, from proprioception to which I can't say, to extraterritoriality, semi-civilized, individual sovereignty, embodied sovereignty, channels, commerce. Like it's very, very rich. And I was keen to tease out some of the kind of key connections that you saw between some of those elements. And the book does move through them, which is nice. And it's kind of like moving through an urban space as well. You kind of dwell in different neighborhoods for a bit. But I wanted to pull out some things, and then particularly as they relate to debt and finance. So I suppose the first question is, what does the idea of semi-civilized do now beyond the sort of violence bits? So there's an argument there about Iraq and Gaza and the ways in which violence is racialized. But I wanted to know if you thought it was doing work within, say, the contemporary sovereign wealth funds and the relations of the Gulf with Egypt, because being ignorant about it, but like I would assume that at least some of it is dressed up in much more solidaristic language, like sort of brotherhood or solidarity or kind of regional growth and development, all of which kind of has roots in a sort of anti-imperial history as well, right? And so if you look at how China elaborates its relations of indebtedness with others, it very much puts forward solidarist language and is quite keen to avoid framing it as semi-civilization or anything like that because of the history there. And I also wanted to then push you on. So there's a really nice way in which you describe the work that the semi-civilized category does with regard to finance during the Ottoman period, because it's like a particularly juicy investment opportunity for your colonial bankers, right? Because on the one hand, it's open for business, but on the other hand, precisely because there is some infrastructure or something there, like there's more to capture. And I wondered whether that was still something that you wanted to draw out. So I was thinking about emerging markets and all of the language that people use to think about high risk, high reward environments and whether that's still functional. The second question is about extraterritoriality, and the story that you tell in the book is really clear about the work that extraterritoriality does in governing commerce. And it enables a kind of mobility of agents to kind of go around and always be governed by their own kind of jurisdictions. And it also, if you can see something like the Ottoman Public Debt Administration as a moment of extraterritoriality, it's the claiming of sovereignty over a debt regime. So my question is, does finance still need extraterritoriality, or has the freedom of capital been endogenized to all of the different laws of different states? So I'm thinking of something like bilateral investment treaties in which property rights of corporations are just pretty much universal because everybody has signed away the right to nationalize or expropriate those kinds of things. So I'm wondering if the carve-out is now so global that extraterritoriality is not like specific, but like a generalized condition almost. And how is that kind of negotiated politically? I was interested in what you said in the presentation about the Iraq War being a sort of a claim about extraterritoriality. I'd love you to expand on that as well. My third question is about this category of relational finance, which you used to describe the Ottoman system of commerce. So as I understood it, it was about how finance was always embodied in the relationships and networks of this group of people spanning across the empire, also the Indian Ocean, and, you know, established communities kind of go around. And it seemed to me that the sort of personalization of finance there, you weren't kind of singing its praises, but you were just saying it was a feature of what it was. But I wondered whether you would want to go further and say it was, in fact, a sort of a better system than the depersonalized or excessively abstracted, multi-layered system we have now. Because there was a sort, yeah, I got the feeling in the book that that was a kind of positive historical example. And then I was wondering though, but wasn't that also kind of also parasitic? And can something be simultaneously parasitic and relational, or are those antinomies? And then I think that's, I mean, I don't want to necessarily ask more questions. I think there's just lots of really, really rich stuff in the book, and I think it's a real treasure trove of ideas for people to get into. I suppose the last thing I would ask is, I think finally what you think, or what you would say the anthropological gaze adds to our story of finance, because it comes across very clearly in the book, but I would like, I mean, as somebody who's, you know, worked at both ends as banker and as, you know, anthropologist, why it's important, I think, to maintain this approach to the financial. Thanks so much.
So we can hand it back over to Julia to respond to the discussants, if that's okay.
Whatever.
Yeah,
to hear what you want me to do.
And then after that, we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So please be thinking of your questions for Julia while she's responding.
Okay. I'll try to keep it pretty brief so we get to have more voices out and hear your questions. But first, I want to thank you both for these beautiful comments and really helpful places of pushing me as well. We were talking earlier, Sarah and I, but you know, when you put out a book and you work on it forever and then it's out in the world, and it's always kind of, at least for me, it's always shocking. It's like, wow, people read this and have so many things to say. So I'm immensely grateful. Thank you. First, there's so much here, and what you are capturing and talking about is really moving, to talk about this thing and the tension of the stuckness of the local and your own experience of that. So I want to thank you for how you framed that. That was very moving to hear. So thank you. And how it's interesting for me, I hadn't thought that the way I was writing about nationalization was as some kind of objective forces of, like, you know, development of the forces of production or something, or outside of political conflict and struggle. I think that It was, you said, an experiment with no politics. I wrote about it like an experiment of no politics. I'll have to look back at what I wrote to see if I did that, because that would be very far from what I wanted to say. But so I'm going to think about that. So I'm just going to think with that. I may not have answers to all your questions, but they're great questions. And the point that I also want to open up for more discussion is absolutely in terms of the politics that are with us and the global politics and the global order, China. I have the Soviet, I just mentioned the Soviet Union there with the Mugama before, the revolution, up before 52, but absolutely, we're living in a moment in which, the global, obviously, to state the obvious, the global geopolitical order is changing dramatically, and how that impacts on finance as well. And what I wrote about in this book is semi-civilized finance, but drop that for a second, is huge. And this relates also to this relational finance and this picture I draw. And it's an article that was in the Journal of Cultural Economy, if anyone's interested in this stuff. It has more Ottoman detail in it. And there's an anecdote where, or someone named Nathan Tankus, I don't know if anyone's a finance geek out here who, Nathan.
I used to read his Twitter feed, yeah.
So someone who works a lot on monetary, who's like deep in the Federal Reserve structure and knows all this stuff, like more than any human being could know about how global finance works, and especially the US order. He tweeted one day, "Oh, I'm going to study the Ottoman Empire. I heard that they have multiple currency regimes." And someone wrote to him and said, "Oh, talk to Julia." But I mean, he and I are in touch because of my Fed days. I have some papers I'm giving to him, but we're at a moment, and in that paper, the one that's in Journal of Cultural Economy, I don't know if it's in the book, where I point to the work of some economists in critical financial studies, where they're saying this is what economy and finance always were. I mean, this notion of this period that was kind of in the interwar period of this abstract finance, unitary monetary regimes. We all know this. I won't mention all the people like Tim Mitchell who've been here and, and obviously worked on this so much, are over in the era of BRICS. I mean, right now, whatever's happening, whether Trump is going to reassert dollar dominance via stealing oil of Venezuela and resources, of Greenland to assert, because what matters there is not even so much getting control over the oil itself. I'm switching topics here, but they can't get the oil from Venezuela. To get it to actually work would take in a huge investment that Exxon, they're saying, no way, we don't want to waste our money on that. But what matters is that it's denominated in dollars, and we're enforcing dollar currency, reasserting the dollar as the currency of account. So this is all in play right now. I wouldn't say I'm kind of shifting between you, forgive me. I wouldn't say that was better or worse. That's not really where I'm coming from, but there are objective shifts that happen in geopolitics that are, I'd say, as someone who's an ethnographer, that are captured or that you can see in very specific moments and places. So that's really what interests me. So yes, China, BRICS, I wouldn't say how China talks. Keep in mind, China was also called semi-civilized. The Ottoman Empire was the point at which the theory was made, but China was considered under the same framework, also because of extraterritoriality, which Opium Wars, and in part we're fought over that. So there is some kind of a shift. I mean, we can call it, I don't want to do that, but it'd be a good marketing slogan. It's the era of the semi-civilized in a way. There's some kind of, skip that though. It's too neat. I don't want to do that. But I'm saying that China was also considered under that category. And this time of we're at the time of multipolarity, multiple currency regimes, is definitely impacting on things. There's much more to say about your beautiful comments, but I'm going to shift for a minute. So does finance still need extraterritoriality? I don't know if it needs it, but it goes on doing its thing. Finance, money, of course, is the ultimate, Marx, Simmel, everyone who writes about money, the universal commensurate is everything, wipes out individual difference and nationality, et cetera, et cetera. is the personal better? I don't think so. I don't know if it's needed. I don't know at all. I mean, I'm just kind of, I'll do the cop out of speaking as an anthropologist. Like I was working in a place, these categories were there, the paper showed up, it had the word local on it. I just tried to figure it out. That's really a cop out, but in a way, that's kind of the scale at which I work. People were, talking about the Khawaga. I was a Khawaga, I was a this, it was there. So I try to make sense of it. I'm not trying to make a theory, much as my joke about the semi-civilized era. I don't know, it helped me explain to myself, at least, my material. And I hope it was somewhat useful to other people. What does anthropology give to finance? Read Gillian Tett. Anthrovision, there's a lot of, I teach on that a lot, but we won't spend it adds something, I would say, and we could talk about it more if people are interested. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now, Lisa, and then, just so we can open up discussion.
I'll just say, we actually unplugged the table.
Oh, that's right, I was wondering why I didn't. No, I'm good, I'm still good.
Okay,
It's fine.
okay, great. So questions, yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Aisha. I also work on extraterritoriality in a
Oh, Aisha, what's your second name?
Polat.
Okay, thank you, nice to meet you, yeah.
I was examined by Umut Osu, if that means
Okay,
anything.
thank you, yes.
I'm also working on that, and your book has given me like a language, a conceptual language to explain so many things that I see in the archives. So thank you.
I was gonna, thought you might say you got it all wrong.
No. Go along.
Yeah. It's over, I'm done with it.
Again,
You
lots
know.
of things I will cite. I was just gonna say, ask two things.
Please.
One is about what the Semilized is doing as like a methodological perspective, but also is it both a methodological and ethical perspective? I'm mainly asking that from the perspective of and I don't know if you read Louisa Yousfi. So her book has just been translated by Verso. It's called Reste Barbar, to stay barbarous. It's like an ethical injunction, but also like a methodological and an ethical injunction, which I think plays along a similar line with what your book is trying to do, in a much more political way. But I think with the concept of semi-civilized, and with the logic of improvement, as you say, which is like lying dead on the ground at this point. There's no improvement. There's only the logic of biology, and there's extermination. That's it. But with the logic of improvements, there's the possibility of assimilation, which is, I think, politically places like the colonial world in a very problematic place, because the kind of post-colonial conservatism that we see that construes this BRIC alliance and solidarity is still capitalistic, it's still parasitic, it's still predicated on violence and debt. And so I'm just would like you to think about the political implications along with or separate the political from the methodological implications of using the concept semi-civilized to understand the world, I suppose.
I'm sorry, the which from the
Methodological and the political.
Okay.
And the second thing is about, and this actually pertains to, I think, Meera's point about whether or not extraterritoriality has become generalized to the point that it is irrelevant today. I was just thinking that in the context of extraterritoriality was supposed to be a lesson in running a good empire. It was supposed to synchronize these semi-civilized laws and rules and jurisdictions into the demands of colonial modernity and capitalism, effectively. I was just wondering, what kind of a temporal order do you see being enacted in the past to the present, with financialization, with debt, with dispossession, that creates this generalized condition? I think there's something there. I think there's something to the extent that extraterritorial is generalized, or the world has become more and more interlinked and more synchronized. That speaks to a certain kind of temporal condition rather than spatial, which is something that you focus on very well. But I was looking for the temporal element there, what is going on with time? What has extraterritoriality done to time?
Absolutely.
I'll take a few.
I'll just say one quick thing, if I may. You have Nasser Abu Rahme coming here in a few weeks, so we'll talk about time a lot. But yeah, absolutely great questions. Let's add more. Yeah.
Okay, more questions.
Thank you so much for this. I wanted to pick up on Reem's comments at the risk of repeating them. I loved the chapter on Barzakh and proprioception. Proprioception is a word that I haven't heard since physical therapy after spraining my ankle. Yeah, in which my physical therapist told me that my proprioception sucked. So that's the context of it. So I thought that these were the exact right sort of terms to think through this question of sort of groundlessness or shaken ground that the book thematizes. There was a point though at which so this is I'm looking at the top of page 172, in which the terms sort of diverge for a moment, proprioception and Barzakh. They both seem at first to be doing the same thing, but then you say so the politics of proprioception, they invite us to increase our capacity for proprioception across the Barzakh when illusions of stability and equilibrium have disappeared in waves of hope and disappointment. So Barzakh, this sort of, as Reem sort of kind of beautifully recapitulated for us, being this kind of constitutive groundlessness, this sort of nothing between two things. So proprioception seems to be what the politics of proprioception seem to be what would allow us to sort of get across the Barzakh to perhaps get to the other side and find stable ground again. That's sort of the one way in which I read that sentence. So proprioception not as simply sort of sitting in this kind of unstable ground, but as actually offering a way out. And in the very next paragraph, with I guess forgive me for reading a bit more, but I think it's important. The way you phrase it is important. You say the politics of proprioception invite us to consider what happens and how to respond when the ground is upended and shaken and dissolves under our feet like salt. They invite us to take the opportunity to increase our capacity to live on the earth when the illusions of its stability disappear. And then one sentence later, this implies too a politics of remembering and defending the embodied commons, which is what Reem spoke about, which was also a phrase that kind of jumped out at me. And so I wonder what is this embodied commons? And is this kind of a sort of new ground that we can sort of, where we can find our footing sort of in the aftermath of the sort of shaken ground that has been sort of precipitated by all the kind of ruptures and disasters that you kind of outline in the book? What is the embodied commons? At some point, I think you say that you quote someone as describing it as the history that we wear on our backs, right? So is that, but so is it history? Is the embodied commons history? But that seems a little bit dangerous, right? Because, you know, I have my history and you have yours, and history is, there seems to be a lot of history around us at the moment, and not a lot of, you know, a lot of sort of dangerous history. So I guess what is the embodied commons, and is it a new ground, or do you conceive the embodied commons as a sort of constitutively groundless, and how does that work?
Thank you. Good questions.
Great. Yeah, Honey, go for it.
Hi, nice to see you here. I'm so thrilled to have you here. I absolutely loved reading the 2 chapters that you recommended. I'm excited to read the rest of the book. So, and your first book, of course, was just so incredibly generative. So thrilled to see this out. I guess I myself am still in the thick of trying to work through the question of debt. So I'm going to come back to maybe some of Meera's comments and sort of use this forum as an opportunity to maybe sort of lay out some of my own maybe confusions that don't arise specifically from your text, but kind of situating your intervention within maybe some of the by now more kind of conventional ways that some of us have been thinking about the question of debt. So the first thing that was really interesting for me was this kind of, the way I'm seeing it, this kind of third space that you're opening up by situating the Indian Ocean and the Ottoman Empire as distinct from the paradigm of sort of quantified, violent, monetary European style debt. And then on the other hand, the kind of native debt, the gift economy that is somehow innocent, and the kind of flipping between these two extremes is something that I've been sort of sitting with for a very long time. And that third space that you're sort of kind of pushing us to think about, which is also Fahad Bishar's sort of sea of debt space, is one that you know, I'm still trying to maybe like Meera, if this is sort of what you were getting at, thinking through. Is the relational something that prevents the debt in this sort of Ottoman context being exploitative and also subject to the violences of quantification? Are we out of, you know, that space of I guess capitalism and exploitation when we think of this sort of Indian Ocean and Ottoman sort of space? And maybe we are, but I guess I'm so curious to see a sort of thicker description, or maybe yeah, a kind of a clearer take on what it is that renders that different from the European paradigm. And then I guess, how does that sit with, you know, Graeber's, you know, 5,000 years of debt? Again, I think we sometimes end up being stuck in the same sort of dichotomous thinking of a sort of, you know, everything that we're seeing now has a sort of, let's say, an Ottoman history. But when we're reading Graeber, we're talking about kind of cyclicality over a very long period of time, which makes me think, you know, in some ways, is the Ottoman moment an exception in Islamic history? When we have that kind of much, you know, history of the world, if I can use that horrible word for a second, the world. And the reason why I wonder about that, the Ottoman Empire as a kind of exception, is, well, actually, let me just park that for a second. Sorry, it's my second point. I guess just having read those two chapters, I was left with the sense that there was a bit of sort of normative ambivalence about the word extraterritoriality, or maybe I was trying to suss out where you sort of stood on that. And so it would be really helpful for me to hear from you more explicitly about, you know, whether there is something to be valorized in that Ottoman moment that also was so beautifully displayed in the travel document, the exit document of your great grandfather. So that was like a beautiful instance of sort of extraterritoriality. Does that push back against what I've understood to be a kind of prevailing approach to the capitulation sort of regime as somehow the beginning of the end of the, you know, as the thing that was sort of the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, you know, a space of sort of privilege that European merchants were able to use to protect their own investments, but prevented locals from being able to assert their own rights against of those European merchants. And a kind of, and I desperately need to read the mixed court chapter, because was this also a whittling away of the Sharia sort of episteme, and a jurisdiction that in theory would allow, you know, Jews, Muslims and Christians to be able to adjudicate commercial and other issues under it. So kind of, you know, is that also a regime that is kind of extraterritorial, the Sharia one that is, that comes to be eclipsed through the capitulatory sort of extraterritorial regime that you talk about? That was, you know, very, very long. But...
That's great. So some very expansive questions. I think we'll hand it back over to you, and then we'll have another round of questions in a moment. Yeah.
Can I just say these are just great questions? Can I move here? No. Okay. So seriously, thank you so much for these great questions. Let me some notes. Okay. Extraterritoriality is coming up a few times. Methodological versus the political implications of the semi-civilized. I'm going to have a really boring answer to some of your questions, which is that I don't know. You know, it's kind of like this is a cop-out. I'll say it and then I'll try to give some more serious response engagements with your very serious questions that I think all of you are going to take further than I did. But seriously, in a way, I have material I try to figure out. I figured out that that's what they called it, and then I put it together. I'm not sure of the implications. I'll say I'm not trying to make like a meta theory, but the methodological versus political implications of for me, it's politically important because it helps me understand some things. It helps understand some of the particular dynamics of outside of assuming that things are developmental failures or even Orientalism, or that well, that's a whole other topic, but another way of thinking about relations between Western Europe and the area of the Middle East that for me answered some things that terms of colonialism, Orientalism didn't do. So that's a conceptual thing that was driving me. I think it has political implications because I think it shows some of the continuities, but is it an unending historical continuum? I don't know. Methodologically, I don't see methodology in it except insofar as I think it's really helpful. And here again, the cop-out of, I'm not crazy about my profession, but sometimes there's things that are helpful in it. Where there are, treating in the history of thought, certain things, taking them seriously in their own right, whether it's Cambridge School history or, ethnography, native concepts. There are a lot of concepts out there that we're organizing the world. And I disagree about the characterization of the Ottoman moment or the Ottoman. I mean, we're talking about an empire of 600 years. So we're not talking about a moment. This is part of global trade, global infrastructures from which England and then Great Britain and France were not external. They were internal to it. And here I'm jumping forward to yours, Henny, but the transformation happens from the inside. It's not that the capitulations come in as an instrument of imperialism to extract value. Those channels were already there. It's just that the power of it shifts of who's controlling the channels, things moving in what directions is more how I work. I work a lot with the concept of the parasite. That's in the chapter on phatic labor and infrastructure from Michel Serres and others, where there's an element in the system, in the channel that's there, but it shifts things. But the whole way that we've been thinking, or some people have been thinking about this only in terms of capitalism or financial capital, all of our great theories of imperialism, through Rosa Luxemburg. I mean, there is a sense of finance coming from the West as a, overproduction of capital and then moving out. And I find that problematic, let's say. So I don't know if that's political. I don't know if it's methodological, but I'm trying to think from the concepts of the place where I'm thinking from, if that's not too circular, that were part of an equally global order. I'm dying to read the book that you mentioned, State Barbarous.
Stay barbarous, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about. Is extraterritoriality so generalized that it's irrelevant in a way, but that has a lot of implications for sovereignty and the state, which a lot of people have different opinions on now, whether you think sovereignty was always a bad thing, we should deterritorialize. I happen to think it's a problematic thing, but it's I don't know. Yeah, the temporal condition of all of this is central to the book. I hadn't thought about the book of concentrating more on space. I'll have to look at that. I hadn't considered it in that way. Yeah, so there's a lot more in the question. Maybe we can talk more later. Yeah, so proprioception and the Barzakh. Yeah, so it's very interesting. Maybe the first time I talked about this work, I had someone say to me, because I've been on a kind of rant against Foucault, some aspects of Foucault for many years in some of my first writings, and resistance everywhere. They got, everything's resistance. This is resistance, that's resistance. And so some of the I formulated as like against resist, because it was some stuff that I wrote earlier that was instead of resistance, like everywhere is resistance, breathing with enough. This isn't about Foucault. Let's think about this different way with proprioception and movement and collectivity. And someone said to me, so you think we should, a Palestinian student, like, so you think we should like dance? I mean, so it's really gotten me thinking. I mean, I don't think I have any of this worked out. I think that there's a lot of people thinking in Black studies. Abdelmalek Simone is someone whose work I think with a lot in habitation. Nasser's, who's coming soon, he's working with inhabitation, ways of being in collectivity. I don't have any pretension to know. I can say more about what I write about embodied sovereignty. Embodied commons means for me. But am I trying to locate the new political subject? No, that was more written against with my huge irritation with Hart and Negri. Sorry, I'm an irritable person. With Hart and Negri. So anyone, after 2011, like everything was the pictures of Tahrir, it's like the commons, the people, the common, the people, as like people who knew nothing about Egypt, nothing about, it became this, poster child of the new political subject of the common. And I found a lot of it kind of irritating. And so I ended up reading a lot because in anthropology and in political theory, actually the commons is very caught up with a kind of Christian moral philosophy. And so I tried to theorize the commons differently. And I have a few articles that are somewhat incorporated into we can always say that as it's in the one you didn't read. No, yeah, about something I call phatic labor and embodied commons, and how these build infrastructures of collectivities on which that are central to political economy and also to the sustenance of collective life. But I'm not an anarchist. I'm not against the state. I'm not like arguing that we're going to have a bunch of collective commons that like will be just self-aid as the future of the world. Right now, I have no clue, I have to tell you. I have no clue what's going to happen. I just hope the world, it will survive. I don't know where the answer is, but that's where I'm coming from with that comment. Does it offer a way? I love the way that you presented it in terms of that there was a way out to somewhere. I think that the ways out that were foreclosed to the semi-civilized are, like I said, the house is, as you read, thank you for reading, has fallen down. So what's next? Surviving and continuing to work together is all I can think of right now. It's up to you guys to figure it out, which again is a cop-out. So the question of debt, I was reading your Liberia piece and some of your work on debt. And so there's a lot more to talk about. I reject that I wouldn't agree that it's a third space. Again, like I said, this is debt and finance that was constitutive also of Western capital, was highly involved in it from the very beginning. I would say concept, but an element of it. I don't think there's such a thing as European monetary debt, at least 17th century. This was a world of commercial society that was coming up. Again, another chapter, in which the wealth from the Levant Company, East India Company was flooding into England, new forms of debt. This is, again, stuff I've written about, the famous Elsewhere. It was one world thing, and the one world. There was a globe, there's let's say, a constitution of new forms of finance, different than, for example, in Oceans of Debt. What's it called? It's not Oceans of Debt. Seeds of Debt. Yeah, I teach it every year, and he always comes and visits, and we have a great time talking about it, which is a particular moment and the relationality of debt. Let's say Indian Ocean, where, in other words, you can inherit debt. It's ending, and that's very gift economy, like anthropology, ending a relationship, like Most said, to refuse a gift is a declaration of war, because what you want is the continuity of the relationships ongoing, expanding in space and over time. And that's an important way to think with, and in the particular Indian Ocean material is incredible. And Bashara in that book totally integrates it with thinking about 18th century rise of political economy. But no way is the gift economy like some other third way that's nice and friendly. It's as, where, it's like, oh yes, in Papua New Guinea, everyone loves each other and they have gifts. And, sometimes political economy people, when they take up gift exchange, they go there. I don't know if you ever see that and get irritated by it, but, normative ambivalence. I don't think I have a normative attitude to it. I think it's just something that was, which again is a cop-out. I don't think we should return to it. There are people who talk about there was like this, romance with cosmopolitanism, the wonderful world where people moved around. And that's been and a better version in Iwa Ong's work also. But the romance, that's something different than is here, and that view of cosmopolitanism as a beautiful, era that was lost, I think is highly problematic. But I don't think the capitulations were the beginning of the end, because it wasn't the beginning. They were always there. It just worked differently when the Ottoman Empire or other empires were stronger than like the upstart English. I mean, we're talking 1581, the first English capitulation. when the Levant Company was formed, you know, and William Harborne bringing all his gifts, you know, his gifts from Queen Elizabeth to the Sultan, and it was a different world. So these things grow up together, but sometimes we have structures in place, not the breaks so much, but a transformation also from within. I've gone on enough now. I'd like to hear anything more or pushback. I want to say, if anyone wants to tell me something didn't make sense, like, you're all so nice, like, back, please, yeah.
Go ahead, yeah.
I was interested in the status of concessions, like around natural resources. It's a simple question where that falls, because they are central in this context, and next door in the larger empire and Iran, in terms of shaping international law, I think, as well. And so, but it involves materials. And yeah, the physicality, which you say is not so much what you want to talk about, because there's a lot of that. But I just wanted to know how that comes up, because I hadn't thought about personal law. I didn't realize, and I was aware of the private international. And so I think you're more focused on the bodies and the embodied sovereignty there and that mobility. But where would you place those?
Concessions?
Yeah.
Like over oil and
status. Yeah, mineral resource, especially in the moment when the structure of finance flips, as you say.
What period? I mean, you're talking about Iran.
19, or in the Ottoman context.
So for me, of course. Yes, please. Yeah, please.
Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you, Julia, for an incredible book. You know, like, your work has been super helpful for me and formative, and it's really nice to see where it's been going. I guess I want to kind of, you know, some of the points that Meera was making, and also a little, I mean, I guess it connects to concepts around concessions, but maybe more specifically, want to think about extraterritoriality in terms of conversations around zones of exception. So you had just brought up Ong, right? There's this whole literature around whether it's Ong, Hasbun, Kishavarzian, and this whole kind of literature around thinking about the reterritorialization of the state. And
Can I, which reterritorialization of the state, meaning?
Right, so there's this debate around, like, globalization, zones of exception. It means that we are deterritorializing, right? And then there was this whole kind of wave of reterritorialization literature. And I was curious, like, where do you see your intervention in terms of thinking about extraterritoriality in that sort of within that discourse, right? And especially because it's really interesting to think about, like, a lot of that literature comes out of a very spatial understanding of those zones, right? And now we're moving into all of those arrangements that you were talking about through sovereign wealth funds, and kind of the assetization that is both extraterritorial, but also not kind of zoned off spatially in the same way. And I'm curious if there's, you know, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about, like, is it really that we're seeing extraterritoriality everywhere? And what's at stake for you in how we talk about sovereignty? And I think I was curious what individual sovereignty was doing in the book, because, like, is it that we want you're pushing us to rethink not just territory, but state? In important ways, or yeah, I mean, I guess that's really the question. And it comes out of, like, I kept asking myself, if we didn't use the term semi-civilized, would you be able to make some of these same arguments without it? So I guess I really kind of just want to hear more about, like, what got you to the term, right? What was really kind of, like, I mean, there's clear moments in the book where it's clear that, like, what you're writing against. But I'm curious, especially, like, coming back to Meera's point, right? Like, we're talking about sovereign wealth funds that are running in the Gulf. They're talking about relationships to China. We're talking about, right? And so a semi-civilized language is situated very specifically within that kind of staged notion of civilization that comes from a very particular anchor. So if we're shifting how those relationships are or we're looking at a different set of relationships, does it still make sense to talk about it as a history that is linked to this condition of the semi-civilized? I hope that made any sense. But thanks.
I have a question at the front here. Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering if the current moment of accumulation depends so fiercely on assetizing, which draws on transferred sovereignties. Like we were talking a lot about sovereign wealth funds and all, but also transferred sovereignties not only to states but also to private capital, to NGOs, empowerment actors, and so on. If that is really drawing on a multitude of elements to accumulate from, which is not simply natural assets or land, but also imaginaries of post-colonial reclamation or multitudes of space and so on. Is there a need to rethink how we understand dispossession for accumulation? Because this is something that comes up in your previous book as well, which some of us in our university program read for a module, and we were quite impressed by how it reframes questions around dispossession. But I would be interested in learning what you have to say about how these new forms of assetizing may lead to changing understandings or changing practices of dispossession.
Well, you mentioned that you were in Slovenia for some time, so it might be outside your field of research, but I was wondering two questions. What's the place of the Balkans in this story, and what's the place of Russia in that story? More different regions.
Thank you.
Yeah, follow-up question.
Can I add something really small, or maybe not too small, but just curious about, since you talk quite a bit about sovereign wealth funds, but where's the role of the corporation and how you're thinking about sovereignty in the moment?
That's it. So great. I'm listen to this. Thank you for these fantastic questions. First about, I was so captivated by what you guys were saying. I forgot to write them down. So forgive me if I forget something on concessions, oil, Iran, 19th century. So I'm not interested. I have come to think about concessions because that's often used to talk about the capitulations as well as concessions. I find that a misnomer that in some contexts, I won't say about Iran, I don't know it well enough, although a lot of my thinking started in graduate school in a context of a comparative empires project. So we were thinking about, Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires together as a form of sovereignty and state. But that said, often I find concessions can be used as with an assumption of territoriality, that there's an assumption that there's a unitary homogeneous territory out of which a concession is made. But I think when a lot of these treaties were signed, that didn't exist. And so there's sometimes continuities of legal forms or of technologies that are adopted into and move forward into the nation state era that then appear exceptional, but they're not. They're incorporated and reworked. So that's the quick and dirty way I would answer that in the interest of time. What's at stake was that, yeah, when I think about sovereignty, why individual sovereignty? Who was asking that? Okay, yeah, okay. I talk about individual sovereignty because, again, I'm going to be a radical empiricist, as I tend to be. It was there in the literature, so I had to take it seriously, and it helped me understand a lot of things. Because that's the way that the sources that I was reading of, international private law, 18th century books, and they were all talking about it. So that's why I started thinking about it. So I didn't so much have anything. I did have something in stake with it as a writer who was trying for 10 years to figure out, and this is a little bit off, but I don't know, are you guys all writing dissertations? And, I'll just say it. For me, I end up with material. I was writing for years about social infrastructures and embodied commons, and I have articles on it. And then I try to turn into, you have to get your damn second book out, hurry up. And then I'd run into the historical, and I didn't know how to write about it. So you're working as a writer to figure things out. So it was kind of cool for someone as sometimes we do. I don't know about the rest of you, but you discover you're writing about the same thing all the time. The first book, NGOs, the state, international organizations, it's also about individual sovereignty, how sovereignty is split up. That's quite a normal situation among different institutions. So I think it's important to note that it exists as a practice in a legal category, because that de-romanticizes or de-exceptionalizes some situations that we find in the world and we have to understand. So for me, I'd say that's the stakes for me. If we didn't use the semi-civilized, would I be able to make a bunch of these arguments? Sure, you know. I didn't, that's this book, but go for it. You know, I mean, yes, but in the case of the other dilemma I was faced with is that I have this, when you're trying to put things together, like think about Palestine and Egypt in the same frame of reference, which is part of my experience, is part of my life. And then that document, the British Mandate one, that really like, I tell you, I had like 5 friends over looking and I was like, what the heck does that mean? Like, how do you think things together that are in the field of what you're working with? And that sometimes forces you to use certain concepts. And semi-civilized was important for me because it gave me a way to think beyond the kind of nation state, the assumptions of territorial nation states with which even often in post-colonial frameworks we end up thinking of. So I've been thinking for ages of how to think about post-imperial cities. And this is part of, if in terms of the question about the Balkans, I just happened to marry into Slovenia. So I'm a citizen, I worked there, I had to learn the language, which was hard, but for me anyway, but it forced me to think about different, and to think about my own life differently, like, and the confines of how I was trained in Middle Eastern studies, because here was another Austro-Hungarian empire, at least in the north or the post, you know, what Austro-Hungary controlled, and between the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the region, there's different, that's a whole other story. But when my husband, who's Slovene, you know, whose family, you know, fought in World War I, it was weird to realize that our grandfathers fought on the same side, you know, in World War I, which is obvious, you know, as an Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian, but it started a period when I was trying to make sense of comparative post-imperial context. So I'm going off from the question, but it helped me think about semi-civilized. The Balkans, by the way, were considered semi-civilized in a lot of this literature. So the way, in terms of what happened with getting state status or not at the end of the World War, it was folded in. Russia is a whole other story. I won't even try to go there. But okay, so yeah, sovereign wealth funds. There's so much here. If we didn't use the sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf that comes from a particular, does it still make sense to think about it? I'm not sure what it is. Some of what helped me in the book, and I refer a lot to the literature on coloniality as opposed to colonialism. I came to that late, but that also helped me escape from assumptions of territory, because a lot of the coloniality literature is very, coming out of mainly study of Latin America, is involved also in structural indebtedness, what happens in the post-colonial world where aspects of the colonial condition endure. So that was something that was helpful for me. I can't remember what the question was about the sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf. Pushback, someone tell me, what am I not answering? Oh yeah, so, okay, I'll tell you guys where some of this started. It was 2013. So I was, on the one hand, doing talks about, as in my economic anthropologist hat or finance person, about, you know, the financial crisis, right? The other hat, I'm following what's going on in Syria. And it's like, these were different hats, right? And one day I saw on the website, I forget her name right now, I write about it, some, you know, just some images of the bombing in Aleppo. And there was one from, sorry? Khana Jumruk. There was an image of Khana Jumruk, and it's bombing, and it says, inside here lived the factory of the English nation in the Levant. And this totally blew my mind. And a lot of how I work and how I always encourage my students as teaching, like when you have moments where you're like, what the hell is that? It's often like really good to hold on to those and unpack them, whatever strikes you intuitively as weird or important. So for me, that was a big moment. And the book I'm writing now is about factories. I'm writing like a long history of the forgotten aspects of the factory that starts on the west coast of Africa, from Portugal, and that's where I got into extraterritoriality, was from the factory of the English nation in the Levant. It's like, what is this, and why are they calling this a factory? And that's the story I'm working on now. And yeah, so that's my particular interest. Acidification and dispossession, how it's changing. I'm going to do the cop out and say yes. Please teach me more. That's a real cop out, but dispossession is not a term I use in this book. It's in Markets of Dispossession, but there is a way in which, because the whole thing about channels and communication theory that was from 18th century that I mentioned, gave me a through thread for the book of where I'm talking about all kinds of channels as infrastructure, as also modes of moving and blocked mobility, and the parasite is kind of what I'm working with in this book. So not like a boom bang it's taken, but of insidious ways in which these changes happen from within as well. The corporation, the story begins with the corporation, of course, with the Levant Company, setting up these factories in Aleppo, in Istanbul. In many ways, I guess the book that I'm writing now is more focused on corporations, but in this book that you have as well, the more historical chapters, it's very much a story of the corporation, because that's why this was private international law. It's because these agreements were forged between the Levant Company, which was chartered by Queen Elizabeth, but it was private. It was a corporation, and the Ottoman state. So it's not public law. It doesn't become public law until much later, when the Ottoman Empire is trying to get out of these treaties, which is private treaties with a corporation. They should be able to, but it gets converted against their will into public international law and what became called unequal treaties. So the corporation is at the heart of the whole thing. And why this was, and part of why it's so important today, this whole structure, is because, again, this is private international law. It's the law of the corporation and the law of the seas. It's not the law of states in treaties. And so that's a little bit of the politics of the moment.
Great. Yeah, we have a little bit of time. I can see there's more questions. So yeah, I'm gonna come to you. Thanks. Go
This
ahead.
is not a question. I just wanted to say, I mean, Meera has already seen me do this before, but there is a new book out from the Fabrique, from the same publishing house that published Stay Barbers, called La Justice du Capital. It's about arbitration courts. It's really good. It's about extraterritoriality arbitration courts by Meera Hassani.
Hassani, okay.
She's new, and this is her first book. It's an amazing book. Highly recommend it.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I just had something I wanted to add to the conversation about debt, sort of a historical point that I've been pondering, which is, so the moment of the 1880s and the debt defaults and unpayable debt, I was looking back at Roger Owen's writings about some of this last week, and I was kind of taken by this sort of kind of parenthetical comment he makes as he's basically talking through the default of Cairo and Istanbul that leads to the OPDA and the Castella debt, and he says, actually, there were 30-some states across the world that defaulted in this very moment. It's the Long Depression, and especially he emphasizes that a number of Latin American states, but also several countries in Western Europe, and he says Spain. He mentions maybe the Netherlands, like they default like 4 times, and like some 10 or 15 states within the United States, they're all defaulting. So it's like, for me, that was kind of like one of those surprise moments, because coming, training in Middle East history, it's like there's the Castella debt and there's the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, and that's the story of the sort of, the crumbling of credit and the unpayable debt. So I guess I just wonder, like, as you know, as you think the link between debt, default, and the semi-civilized, like, I don't know. I'm curious of like if, you know, the people who were writing about the semi-civilized like saw like the debt default of a state in the United States or a state within Western Europe in the late 19th century. Is their state debt default and sort of fiscal crisis like also a marker of the semi-civilized, or is there something different happening in the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire that we would be alerted to there? So thank you.
We can maybe squeeze one more in if anyone's got a final question to add. Okay, go ahead, Henny.
That was a really interesting comment, Nathaniel, but that wasn't actually what I had in mind, although be great to carry on the conversation. Proprioception, to go circle right back to that. I guess just building off of Henry's comments from earlier as well, and you know, the reference to physical therapy or physiotherapy, I forget which is called which, where is this something that is akin to resilience for you? Is it something that can be sort of trained or honed, or you know, just to sort of end maybe perhaps on that note of the opening, or the, you know, the way that one might constitute some kind of politics, I suppose, out of the kind of wreckage that I guess you know, one is very much sort of struck by in the moment. But also in your book, there's a kind of sort of increase in you know, an acceleration towards an almost hopeless sort of moment, right? And then the this concept of the barzakh and proprioception is a moment of kind of opening. So I wondered, is it something that one can work with politically? You know, even the metaphor being something that is about maybe you know, restoring the body. One goes to see somebody who can actually train oneself, train a person towards that. Is that something that we can kind of grab onto?
Okay. Yeah, I think, do you want to
Sure.
respond?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for bringing in Roger Owen, who, by the way, I first met him. He had just come to Harvard. He went to my dissertation defense and told me I got everything wrong. And which of course was true because I hadn't studied with him. So yeah, so thank you. This is an important point. Default was very common in the 19th century. It was the default condition that you can, and that's something that Graeber, of course, talks about a lot, the right to default, which is, of course, the Jubilee, et cetera, but also in terms of states, and was very normal in the 19th century. Default was the default again. So one can say, also thinking where I was thinking with the coloniality literature in relation to that, also the situation of Puerto Rico. I don't know if you guys watched the Bad Bunny. Everyone watched the halftime show, you know, the electrical, when they're climbing up the electrical poles, and the concessions, all about the concessions and the blackouts. I mean, because Puerto Rico also can't default on its debt. You know, it's stuck between the status of not being independent, not being, and that's a mark for a lot of people who are writing from Puerto Rico. I can refer you to some great books that I always forget names. That's part of the condition, is that you cannot default. And that's part of what was imposed in terms of the Ottoman debt, as opposed to Latin America, where slightly different but related dynamics were going on. And I've had interesting discussions with scholars of Latin America about this, because there was something that was similar, but also it was quite different. So there's a lot more to be done on this. I hope, you know, if you're doing it, please do it. I do think that the line between debt and default, and the right to default, the right to start over, is one marker of the semi-civilized, where the condition that I'm pointing to, where you're not territorially colonized, there's not the British flag flying there, but you're stuck with the debt that you're not allowed to default on or to reorganize. In terms of proprioception, yes, I got there too through physical therapy. Many years, many injuries. I write about it in the chapter a little bit. So a lot of ankle issues. do we all just go to physical therapy? That's a little bit what this student pushed me. Like, what are you saying? We should all go to physical therapy. No. So I don't know how it's a politics, but yes, I'm doing ongoing project with colleague Donalyn Rutherford on proprioception. We realized that both of us were working on it some years ago. We have an upcoming meeting also with theorists of sovereignty like Deb Thomas from the Caribbean, Amy Cox in Black Studies also theorizing about sovereignty in the body. I don't know. I have to write something. I have to write something about proprioception after the genocide. And so I'm thinking about this a lot. I don't have answers. Keep it going. Maybe you'll give me a paper. No, I'm joking. Is there a politics that might come out of the wreckage? I have totally lame answers here, which is that we can only hope and it's nice to think that I gave a moment of opening after the hopelessness of that acceleration. That's the tension that I think all of us are living in, in this moment. So what are the politics of it? We are perhaps in a moment we're existing and existing collectively and is a form of resistance, much as I don't really like the word. So in that, is that the politics to which we're reduced right now? I don't know, but it's possible. And to say a lame ending, I'll say you guys have awesome questions. I assume you're wrapping up now. But this was great. It's a great conversation. I have a lot to think about from what you've pushed me on. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Great place to end it. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm sorry, did I take your maybe you were going to I can go on. I can go on an hour. No, I'm having fun. But I'm sure you have other places to go.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks to Meera and Reem.
Beautiful
comments.
Yeah,
And thank you all for
everyone.
Again. And yeah, our next event is in March.
Yes, I want to say the 4th, but I wanted to recheck.
The poster somewhere.
Oh yes, we do.
2 more left this semester. Yeah, okay, 5th of March. Yeah, and then the 12th, Nessa Abuzaid.
The 19th, 5th and the 19th.
Okay, so the next is Martin, who actually was one of the founders of this series and used to organize it. So it'll be great to have him back from Bristol. Is there anything else you want to say? Okay, great. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, everyone.